everybody, and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Gia. I'm a 25-year-old lady who lives in my mom's basement, and today we're going to be talking about all the books that I read in September. I, in total, finished 5 books this month. I stuck to the books that we agreed for our TBR, so I'm accomplishing what I set out to do. But I did start some books early for October, so I'm hoping to get more of a jump on getting some more books read throughout the month, more than 5. I'm trying to read more books throughout the month. September was historical romance month, and I chose 5 romances, 4 of them being in the Regency period and the last one being in the 13th century. 3 of these books were written by Melanie Dickerson because I love her, but also back over the summer I picked up one of her books. It was book 2 in a trilogy, so I decided to pick up 1 and 3. And I read those. I only wrote reviews for one of the books, the first book being A Spy's Devotion. I started reading this at the tail end of August. I read this book in 24 hours and I wrote a review for it. However, I only gave it 3 stars due to a multitude of reasons. While I loved the romantic pairing of Nicholas and Julia together, it was the rest of the background that was quite irritating at times, and it just became too cumbersome for me to enjoy the story to its fullest. Just to give you a brief synopsis of this book, you have Julia, who is an orphan who's sent to live with her aunt and uncle, and her cousin Phoebe, who's 2 years younger than her. At the start of the story, Julia is about 19 years old and her cousin Phoebe is about 17 years old, and our hero is a soldier named Nicholas who was away in the wars against Napoleon, and he is now back after having an injury on the battlefield, and he was sent on an errand by a dying soldier to turn in a diary to a certain person. All he has is a name. He doesn't know who this person is, and he doesn't know where to find this person. We find out that the diary is actually coded. It is full of government codes. The man who was dying was actually a spy, and he gave the diary to Nicholas to deliver to the Britain Home Office of War to give them the diary with all the information that he had collected. So this is also an espionage book, and it goes more into like government conspiracy and whatnot. When it came to the couple as a whole, I did enjoy them. I did like them. Julia is very insecure because she doesn't have that much money to her name. So she knows that she is unlikely to marry well. So she doesn't really put into thought that Nicholas might want to marry her because, her cousin would be better for him. Also, there is a interpersonal conflict between Julia, Phoebe, and Nicholas because Phoebe is basically in love with Nicholas. She has like a puppy love infatuation with him. So when Julia is getting closer and closer to him, this causes conflict with her cousin, who she loves very much. And her cousin was one of the reasons why this story was so difficult for me to enjoy. So when you have this character who's living with her aunt and uncle who are taking care of her but are not giving her a dowry of her own, they're just basically raising her to be a lady of high society and then giving her nothing to be able to marry with. So she's practically doomed to be a governess. So she doesn't have a dowry, but she has the education and the upbringing to be considered a lady of high society. The aunt and uncle are characterized as basically the evil stepmother. They're doing this out of spite. They feel as though they should not prioritize their niece over their daughter because, it's not Julia's fault that her parents are dead, but they don't feel it's their responsibility to become her parents, even though, I heavily disagree with that. But anyway, the aunt and uncle are cartoonishly villainous, and Phoebe was just so annoying. Like, I get it. She was a 17-year-old girl who's has this, basically a schoolyard crush on this man who doesn't want her. And she gets so emotional and so jealous over her cousin receiving any sort of free time with this man that anytime they're spending together, Phoebe is basically insisting that if you love me, you'll get him to, want to marry me. It's you can't make somebody do that, but Phoebe puts Julia in this position where she feels as though she has to. And then there was a situation later, spoiler alert, if any of this sounds interesting to you, I'm not making this sound like it's a good book. But at one point, Julia gets sick, and Phoebe got sick first, but got over it faster. And then Julia got sick, and then Julia got sick worse. And the aunt and uncle dismissed all of the servants and basically left Julia to die. And they were shocked when they came back, and Nicholas had come to see to her to see if she was okay, and basically pushed his way into the house when there was only 2 servants in the entire house. and then got his own personal doctor to come take care of her because she was on the brink of death. And then when the aunt and uncle came back, they were like, oh my God, like I would never like make the servants abandon her like that. Like, why would they do that? It's like you sent them away in the first place because they wanted her to die. So you see what I mean by like cartoonishly villainous, by just they are not good people. They suck. I don't even remember anything about the espionage plot. That must have been good because I really don't, I really don't care about it. I really don't remember anything about it. In the end, I gave A Spy's Devotion 3 stars, but it's more of like a 3.5 because I gave the next book 3 stars and it was much worse, but also 3 stars, like more like 2.5 to 3 stars, kind of. So the next book is A Dangerous Engagement. This is the last book in the Regency Spies of London series, with A Spy's Devotion, A Viscount's Proposal, and now A Dangerous Engagement being the trilogy in question. So this book, I read this book the same week that the Queen died. That's important to the story because in the third book, we go with everybody's in the series. There's a BFF. Her name is Felicity. She is the 12th child of 13, which is a lot for that time. So there's really not a lot in terms of a dowry for her to have in the first place. So she gets invited to the country home of a Lady Blackstone, and she starts to realize that there's a lot potentially going on that she doesn't realize. Because first of all, she realized that there's like no women here. It was like mostly a sausage fest. It was a bunch of dudes. Then they started talking about politics. So basically, in the other books, Felicity had said a couple of offhand things about the wealthy and about the upper class that made listening in ears believe that she had a bit more of a radical political stance than she did. So she and her little royalist self was invited to this estate, and it was full of revolutionaries, and they were wanting to overthrow the government, and they wanted to assassinate the royal family and members of parliament and overthrow the government and begin a democracy much like America. And they kept, like, part of the things that they kept saying is like, well, look what happened to the French. Like, they had such a barbaric revolution, and look how far they've gotten, and how do we know we won't be like them? That was one thing. But then there was just a lot of royalist propaganda that I found to be a little distasteful given at the time, and it was just too on the nose, given the fact that I was reading it the same week the Queen died. Like, I had started it before the Queen died, and then the Queen died before I finished it. So it was like literally right in the middle. So I was, it took me a minute. It took me a couple of days to finish this book because it was hard for me to get through that, and a lot of the rhetoric that the revolutionaries were wanting to support was very akin to like modern American leftist politics, which also was difficult because, they're positing it as bad. Like, this is nothing to say about Melanie. This is a portal to a different time from a certain perspective. That is fine. However, I was just a little unsettled by the fact that this was posing American leftist politics as bad, and then also discussing assassinating the royal family in the same week when the longest reigning monarch in history died. And there was a lot of discussion and conversation about imperialism and how the royal family has done some pretty messed up things throughout history. So this was difficult for me to swallow. I rated it 3 stars. It's more like 2.5 to 3 stars. Of course, like the romance is not bad. What I can say that is a compliment. I will compliment this book. I will compliment this book on the fact that the spy work in this is quite in depth, and I liked it. I will give Melanie that. She really did center the espionage theme. So I felt like it was done really well. You felt it was very on the edge of your seat. It was very suspenseful. Like, what if they get caught? And, they did eventually, of course, get caught. But, like, you were wondering after they were succeeding a number of times. You're like, okay, when's the next shoe going to drop? It was written and positioned in a way that, like, they could have been caught literally at any time. And I thought that that was good because, you know, you can get caught the first time, you can get caught the second time, you can get caught the third time. But each time it was written in this, Melanie wrote it to be like, she could get caught at any time, even though like you kind of knew she wouldn't, just to the nature of the book. But like it was written in a way that it could have happened. I have to give props to Melanie for the tone with the espionage themes. However, the political themes underneath it were a bit too close to home and a bit too worldly given current events. And I felt uncomfortable reading it, to say the least. The next book that I read, and the last book I read by Melanie Dickerson, was A Perilous Plan. It is from the Imperiled Young Widows series. This is book 1, so it's the first one I've read in this. And it is about a girl named Penelope who married a older earl when she was 18 years old. He was older than her, and they are married for 5 years when he is mysteriously murdered. She finds his body. Over the 5 years that they were married, they had no children. He was unkind to her. He didn't outright physically harm her in any way, but he was neglectful. She wanted, you know, this relationship to be full of love and light, and he gave her none of those things. He basically treated her like he needed to keep her at an arm's length, and there was a lot of rumors that he was keeping mistresses. So he essentially like married her for appearances. Also, Penelope's only living relative is her grandmother, who is very cold and very set in traditionalist ways. And so her husband gets murdered, and now she is a widow, and the estate is being passed to his cousin. So she is put in a position where she has to go back to her grandparents' house, and her grandparents, of course, don't want that, or at least her grandmother doesn't want that. There's this whole thing about how the grandparents can't stand to be in the same house together, so it's good that they own more than one, which, whatever. So the grandmother doesn't want to take care of her, so she's basically propositioning Penelope with the "you need to marry again ASAP" thing. But then also her husband just got murdered and they don't know why. And then all of a sudden, Penelope is getting kidnapped. So she gets kidnapped several times in this because apparently her husband potentially stole plans from the English to sell to the French, to sell to Napoleon. That was something about the location of a general so that the general could be assassinated. And he stole these plans to sell them to the French because of gambling debts, because that was another thing. On top of Penelope not getting the wealth from her husband, there was no wealth to receive. He was so deep in his gambling debts that he gambled away literally everything. So he turned to betraying his country to pay off his gambling debts, and it ended up getting him killed. So Penelope finds herself in the situation where she is guilty by association, and she has to ward off both English officials and French spies who are constantly like trying to get their hands on her because they think that she has the plans when she doesn't. There was a club that her husband was a part of where members from that club hired mercenaries to go kill her husband. So our main hero, Henry, who was a part of the club, feels guilty for basically being associated with the people who sent people to get her husband killed, even though he betrayed their country. So the two of them are kind of working together to figure out where the plans are in the first place so they can be destroyed. But then also, Melanie really brings out some mystery tones here. I thought that this was rather well written. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the kind of push and pull between Henry and Penelope. It was like a duality. It was, you know, I don't want him to think that I'm after his money, but also I have nothing to offer him. So it was very like back and forth. And I did appreciate that. It was quite a multifaceted conflict between the two, and they, of course, they do end up together, and they were really cute. I ended up rating this 4 stars. I really liked it. I'm going to forsake the chronological order that I read these books and to talk about the last book I read first, because I want to end this video on a good note and talk about my favorite book last. But also, I'm going to be discussing my least favorite book of the month right here. It is My Enemy, My Heart by Laurie Alice Eakes. This book, much like A Touch of Power, it really started out as a promising premise for me, where you have this strong heroine, Deirdre, who's this daughter of a sea captain who is on a ship that is commandeered by British privateers, and in order to save her as a non-combatant prisoner, she marries the captain of the rival ship that captures hers in order to save his reputation and also keep her safe, because he feels as though, because her father had just died, he feels as though he needs to protect her in some way. She is very headstrong. Deirdre is very hardworking. She's very salt of the earth. She's very much focused on, you may sequester me away and put me in a dress, but that doesn't change who I am. And she is dead set on releasing her crew from the prison and setting them free to go to France. This story is taking place during the War of 1812, which was America and French v. Britain all over again. So after discussing the summary of that, this was a book that I had a lot of hope for. It was very long. It was unnecessarily long. I think you could have shaved 100 pages off of this. This book was 400 pages in the Kindle edition, and it could have easily been shaved down. So Melanie Dickerson usually writes like pretty clean romances. There's no sex, there's no kisses until the last chapter, happily ever after. My Enemy, My Heart really defied my expectations, because in the very beginning we had Deirdre and Kieran, I almost forgot his name. They are almost looking like I wasn't sure what I was walking into. Like sometimes I can pick up a book and I know there's going to be sex in it, but other times it's like I don't know, like it could go either way. But the way that Laurie was writing the two leads, it was like there were going to be some moments that were lustful. The interactions between the two, it was like the watching of the lips and the watching of the body language, and I was astounded when none of that ever happened. It was kind of a fade to black when anything ever happened. So that, and like the leads never overtly like care about each other. They do, but they don't. So like there's no cherishing between the two. There's no cherishing, no devotion, no adoration. It's very, Deirdre keeps Kieran at arm's length and Kieran does everything he can to protect her. It's very if I want to say beige, like if I were going to compare this romance to anything, it would be the color beige, because it's very neutral. I can't even say love and respect each other, because I mean they don't even want to admit that they love each other, and Deirdre is constantly trying to conspire against him. But the reason why I say this book could have been shorter is the fact that most of the last half of the book was every chapter Deirdre saying like, oh man, Kieran's family is so nice to me. It's going to be a real shame when I have to betray them later. And it's like, so when does the betraying happen? Because I'm a bit lost here. Deirdre ends up pregnant. We see from the beginning of her pregnancy to birth. So this story takes place over the course of at least 9 months to a year. There's also this really vague conflict as to why Kieran brought shame to his family in the first place. So he was formally engaged to another woman who ended up being pregnant, and the two of them were caught in a pretty scandalous position, and it was believed that the child was his when it wasn't. And Kieran was insistent that he has never deflowered a lady, and I think it's implied that he is a virgin himself, which this is very obviously like a Christian romance. I didn't realize it until I looked at the tags and then finished the book that this is considered a Christian romance. But Kieran is very insistent that he has never done anything salacious like that with a lady, so that she slept with somebody else and then was rushing into a marriage with Kieran to mask the fact that she had a child out of wedlock. So he is in this situation where he's brought shame to his family for apparently deflowering this girl, and like there's some community conflict with people that are on the other side, like trying to sabotage Kieran and put him in all these situations where like other women are throwing themselves at him as if his marriage doesn't matter, and he's like, excuse me, I have a wife, even though they don't even really like each other that much. That part of the story is not very well explained. Like this I felt as though could have been developed a little bit better, and I'm saying that even though I say the book could have been shorter, like if that conflict was expanded and then Deirdre constantly thinking about how she's going to betray Kieran's family could have been shortened, the story would be 100 pages shorter, period, and it would be better for it. I went into much more passionate depth about this in my reading vlog that went up this week, but I felt like all Deirdre did was just lay around and grow a baby, and that was a problem. I felt like she, as a character who was being introduced as someone who is headstrong and wanting to do stuff, she sure does a lot of laying around. And then when the climax of the story happens, behind the scenes, she did all this manipulation. I had to get through this book on audiobook. This was another one that was difficult for me to get through. So like Touch of Power, thankfully this had a free audiobook companion that I listened to it on Audible because it was just that difficult for me to get through. But I felt like the story went from 0 to 100 because you just had Deirdre laying around doing nothing, and then all of a sudden, oh my God, I'm going to go free my crew from prison. Also, I'm in labor. So that brings up another interpersonal conflict that was stupid and dumb. So Kieran's family, although they love Deirdre, all of a sudden think that she had a child out of wedlock because she is too big for being as far along as she is. Kieran is just like, we've talked about this. Like, this is not a thing. This didn't happen. And then all of a sudden, maybe a chapter later, Deirdre is giving birth and it's like, oh my God, it's twins. When I tell you that I read the part where the parents were telling Kieran that, like, oh, she had to have had a child out of wedlock in order for her to be this large at this stage of her pregnancy, I was like, because she's having twins. That's going to be the twist, is she's having twins. Duh. And then she had twins and they were shocked. And I was like, are you for real? I found myself wanting to research like Regency era midwifery because how can you not know? I mean, if you can, I said this again in the reading vlog, if you can palpate your own stomach as a pregnant woman and figure out where the head of your child is, can't you figure out that there's two? Was one hiding in the back, like closer to your insides, and one was on the outside, like the babies were like positioned in a way that like you could only feel one? I don't know how that was possible. In the end, I rated this book 2 stars. It really just absolutely failed my expectations, and there were just a lot of interpersonal conflicts that I found to be unnecessary, to say the least. So I gave it 2 stars. I'm sorry, Lori. I messed up saying your name many times during my my reading vlog clips, but I'm sorry. And then the last book on this list, this is actually the highest rated of the 5 that I read this month. It is rated a 4.22 out of 5 stars, which is quite high. It is A Dark Knight's Captive Bride by Natasha Wilde. So this is another book that, like A Dangerous Engagement, I found myself kind of going, like squinting a little bit at the themes of conquering and imperialism, because this story has a lot of political undertones, but I think that it does this much better. So I read this book right before I read My Enemy, My Heart, and both of them, in addition to some other books I read, but they had very, very heavy geopolitical undertones, and I think that this book does it the best. So in this story, we start with our princess, Gwen. She is the Princess of Wales. When we first meet her, she is 16 years old. She is, again, the daughter of the Prince of Wales, and it is at this time where there has been a lot of conflicts between Wales and England, and Richard I is coming into power. He's still a young king at this point, and there is a lot of time skips in the very beginning. So when Gwen is 16 years old, she meets a man in a stable, and his name is Richard. That's all she knows about him, is that his name is Richard. And they have a pretty like tender meet cute. Nothing happens, which I was thankful for, and I was thankful for the time skip because Jesus Christ, she was 16 years old. In our next time skip, Gwen is now 19 years old and Richard is now like 26. They're about 7 years apart. Richard is an earl who serves King Edward I, and he is kind of sworn to do literally everything that King Edward says. And Edward is trying to find a way to unite Wales and England, and so far through armed conflicts that has not been going very well. And then on Gwen's side of the conflict, they are like poised with the English as the oppressors, and they're just trying to have their independent life as Welsh people. Meanwhile, her uncle is kind of like Scar in The Lion King, in that he's this dejected prince who is kind of thrown out and he's exiled because there's a power imbalance between Gwen's father and her uncle. It is at this time, when Gwen is 19 and Richard is 26, that King Edward goes, oh my God, I have it. I have the answer. You guys are going to get married. And they both hate this idea because they both believe that the other person is the person who's causing the most harm in this war. I talked about this book extensively in my reading vlog. So if you want to go and see some more in-depth discussion as to how I feel about this, then I would recommend going to read that, because I don't want to repeat myself, and I know I'm going to miss out on some things because I spoke about this book when it was fresher in my mind. But the two of them believe that the other is the real enemy. There's a lot of hatred, there's a lot of conflict between the two of them, so much so that Gwen's father pushes off the wedding for 2 years. 2 years, because he does not want to send his daughter to marry this man who is believed to be basically the king's lapdog that is sent in to like kill the most people, to torture the most people. He's believed to be like super evil, and they never discredit that, but then he's always like, I did it because I was told to, which is not a great excuse. But they kind of like dust over that. They kind of like miss that point, which I guess could be considered a fault of this book. The two end up married, and Gwen finds herself in a position where she can no longer call Wales her home. She has to now become English, but she still wants the Welsh people to have their own independence. So she finds herself in this like situation where she is falling in love with her husband who fights for England, but then she wants to fight for her people and for her father, and she finds, conflict in this. I thought that the underlying geopolitics here were done quite well. You see it's true like gray morality, like from a historical standpoint, of course, the English are the oppressors. The English were always the oppressors. But when it comes to this individual story of a historical fiction account of this real thing that happened, there is a lot of gray. And that sort of like gray positioning was what I found more enjoyable about this book that had political undertones instead of the other books, particularly in My Enemy, My Heart, when Deirdre wants to set her crew free and send them to France. They were wanting to join the French in war, in battle against the British. So Deirdre didn't care about the ramifications of sending her men to France to then fight with France, and didn't care about whether they died working with the French. She just didn't want them imprisoned by the English. So she didn't really take into account like what their lives would be like after they were released. She just cared about the issue right in front of her. There was very little thought given to what would happen after they were set free. And I found that to be conflicting. I didn't like that. Like, if you're going to discuss a political conflict, you need to discuss all sides, real or imagined. And also, morality needs to be discussed because, again, from a historical standpoint, the English were always the oppressors. Not everybody is innocent. Not everybody is doing this for their own gain. People are only doing this to survive. It's very clear that there are ramifications and that there are effects that happen to everyone, which I think is a better way to tell a story if you're going to talk about history and politics. So anyway, I rated that book 4 stars. It was awesome. There was also a lot of sex. So if that is your thing, then go right ahead. It was very much an opposite in the ways of passion from the other 4, in that it went from clean romances to very, very dirty sex. Like, there was sex like every chapter, but it didn't feel like, maybe if I reread it, I would feel differently, but it didn't feel overdone or egregious. It was just there, and it wasn't even like drawn out. It was just kind of like there, and then it was over, and like 2 or 3 pages later, and I was like, oh, okay, whatever, and like just keep on going. So if that's your thing, then go ahead and read it. But if it's not, I would recommend you potentially stick to the vibes of the other 4. So yeah, those are the 5 books that I read in the month of September. Right now, I am reading A Court of Mist and Fury, which the video for that will be going up tomorrow if you're seeing this upload day. So The next video will be a sequel Saturday video, a reading vlog of A Court of Mist and Fury, in which I read sequels to books that I enjoyed and want to continue the series of. I figured I would give them their own series because they're not just books that I read and sort of enjoy, they're books that I want to continue. So I figured I would give them their own spotlight. Thank you guys so much if you've made it to the end of this video. If you'd like to stick around, you can find me on Twitch, Instagram, Twitter, literally anywhere that I have an icon in my social banner. I'm going to go ahead and get started on the rest of my October reads. I have a lot of them because I went a little wild at the library about a week and a half ago, so I gotta get cracking because I haven't opened any of them yet. So I'm gonna get started on my October reads. Remember to drink water and be nice to each other and exude kindness and empathy with everything that you do. If you follow me on Twitch, we're going to be implementing a new stream schedule in the coming weeks, so stick around for announcements on that on Twitter. And I will see you guys in the next video. Bye!